Carleton.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. If this pandemic has taught us anything, it is to be prepared for the unexpected, to anticipate risks before they metastasize so that we can protect ourselves and we can secure our future. And so today I rise in the House of Commons to draw the attention of members to a growing risk of danger to our families, to our businesses, and to our entire country. And it is the risk of the $8.6 trillion of household, corporate, and government debt that is quickly accumulating on the shoulders of Canadians. This amount equals 387% of our GDP, a record ratio, higher than the ratios in many countries that have in the past experienced devastating debt crises. Before our eyes glaze over, though, I want to remind members that a debt crisis is not just something that bankers and financial analysts talk about on the business report on business or on BNN. Research by reputable academic institutions show that in the case of financial crisis, house prices can drop by a third, stock markets, meaning people's savings, by half, the economy by 9%, and unemployment can rise 7 percentage points. Now here's the human toll of that. University of Calgary published a study recently showing that there's a 2 percentage point increase in suicides for every 1 percentage point increase in unemployment. Imagine the human cost of losing 7% unemployment then. More data is now showing an inextricable link between opioid abuse and unemployment. Depression and homelessness result from these types of crises. So what is the nature of the risk? How serious is it? How likely are we to face it? Well, we have to look to history. In their now a legendary book, This Time is Different, our Harvard economists Carmen Reinhart and Professor Ken Rogoff wrote about what they called 8 centuries of folly. They studied debt crises in 66 countries across 5 continents. They write in their opening, each time the experts chime, this time is different, claiming that the old rules of valuation no longer apply and that the new situation bears little similarity to the past disasters. With this breakthrough study, we have found definitively that they are wrong. Now, they lay out 5 standard leading indicators for a forthcoming financial crisis. I will go through them very quickly. First, falling economic output. Second, a large debt buildup. Third, rising household leverage. Fourth, asset inflation. And fifth, large current account deficits. So, do these 5 standard leading indicators apply to us? Let's start with the first one, falling output. Last year in 2020, our GDP dropped 5.5%, blowing a more than $100 billion hole in our economy. That is a massive reduction in our economy, and it means we have $100 billion less to service our debts. So on the first test, from This Time is Different, check. We do have falling economic output. It doesn't matter who's to blame. It doesn't matter that it was COVID that caused it. What matters is the math, and the math does not lie. So let's move on to the second standard leading indicator, and that is debt buildup. Now, the amount of debt that a country can shoulder depends on the income that it produces to service that debt. According to the great Canadian economist John Kenneth Galbraith, and I quote, all crises have involved debt that, in one fashion or another, has become dangerously out of scale in relation to the underlying means of payment. That underlying means of payment, of course, is GDP. So let's look at the size of our debt and how much it has grown. Since the beginning of 2015, our total debt, public and private, has gone from $6.1 trillion to $8.5 trillion, a nearly 40% increase in our debt. During that time, our GDP has only grown by 13%. In other words, our debt levels are growing almost 3 times as fast as our GDP, the underlying means of payment. We've now reached a level of debt to GDP of 387%, which I said earlier, but I didn't tell you that that is an all-time record and nearly twice the size of the typical ratio over the last 60 years in Canada. And here's some more staggering information. The debt to GDP ratio in Greece, when it had its massive sovereign debt crisis 10 years ago, was 330%. In the United States, during the great financial crisis that came out of the mortgage bubble, their debt was 375% of GDP. In other words, our debt levels in Canada today are higher than they were in the United States and Greece when they had massive, iconic, and devastating debt crises in the recent past. And so we need now to pay heed as to why we think we can avoid the same fate. The only difference between them then and us now is that interest rates are low, but that won't stay that way forever. So what is the composition of our debt? Where does it come from? Well, the answer is threefold: government, corporate, and household. Let's start with government. This year, for the first time on record, Statistics Canada shows that the gross debt of all levels of government in Canada is bigger than GDP. It just exceeded 100%, 100.3% to be precise, in the third quarter of 2020. That has never happened before. We are higher than we were in the 1990s when we had our own miniature near default of the federal government. That time, it was 92%. So our debt levels are higher than ever before when it comes to government. And before they rise and claim that we have the lowest debt in the G7 as a share of GDP, that is just wrong. The only reason that Finance Canada calculates it that way is because they use the assets in the CPP and the QPP to deduct from our overall net debt without using the corresponding liabilities that those funds must pay. And as a result, if you ignore those and look at our gross debt, we have higher debt levels than both the Germany and I believe it's also France in the G20. Excuse me, in the G7. So that means we are not the lowest, and we cannot be worry-free in fooling ourselves that our sustained buildup of government debt is not a problem. And this year has seen a spectacular and never before seen increase in that debt. Our deficit is $381 billion. That's almost 7 times bigger than the previous all-time average, and it equals 17% of our GDP. Now, let's put that into perspective. In World War I, our deficit to GDP was 8%. In the Great Depression, it was 6%. In the Great Global Recession, it was 4%. In other words, our deficit as a share of the economy, adjusted for inflation, is currently twice what it was at its peak in World War I, 3 times what it was at its peak in the Great Depression, and 4 times what it was in the Great Global Recession. Only in the Second World War was it bigger, and our ancestors, when they came back from war, immediately began repaying that debt, running the biggest surpluses ever in 1947, and then increasing the size of our economy 11-fold in the 2.5 decades that followed, that allowed them to pay it off quickly. Nobody is suggesting that we will come anywhere near to those kinds of surpluses or growth levels in the post-COVID era, which means our debt situation is arguably more ominous to the country than it was even back then. So, on that criteria, the second standard leading indicator, a sustained buildup of debt, check. Canada meets that as well. We move on to household debt levels. Canada has the highest level of household debt as a ratio of disposable income in the G7. In fact, recently, our level of household debt grew to bigger than the entire Canadian economy. Again, setting records. These ratios mean that our households are carrying more debt than our economy can reasonably be expected to support. According to the president and CEO of CMHC, I'm going to quote here, Canadians are among world leaders in household debt. Pre-COVID, the ratio of debt to GDP for Canada was at 99%. These ratios are well in excess of the 80% threshold, above which the Bank of International Settlements has shown that national debt intensifies the drag on GDP growth. In other words, an international body like the Bank of International Settlements says don't go above 80%. And now, pre-COVID, we were at nearly 100. Since that time, debt levels have risen even higher. So that is the third criteria for a forthcoming debt crisis: rising household leverage. Check. So now we move on to the next one, which is asset inflation. Well, in Canada today, the assets that Canadians own in the country are worth 17 times the size of the Canadian economy. The historic average is 12 times. In other words, our asset values are quickly outpacing our economy. That's something that can't go on for long because, of course, assets can only be purchased out of the income that is generated in the economy. And so those assets break down into two parts: financial assets and real estate assets, more or less. Financial assets. You look at the S&P TSX, which is the broadest index in the country. Until a few years ago, the market value of that index had never exceeded the size of our economy. It was always smaller than GDP. That changed in the last 24 months and suddenly rocketed up to 120%, according to Rosenberg and Associates, a leading economic research firm. So that one index is now worth 120% of GDP. That has never happened before. The companies on that index need to generate their profits from the economy. And therefore, the value of the stocks on the index cannot get completely out of touch with the ability of the economy to generate income and support those stock prices. And then you move to real estate, where prices are up $65,000 this year. Can you imagine, Madam Chair, that in a year where our economy has lost over $100 billion of economic output, where hundreds of thousands of people have lost their paychecks and been forced into their homes, that somehow we found all this money to buy real estate? In fact, in the year from the beginning of 2019 to mid-2020, the inflation of our assets in this country has been worth more than our entire economy. $2.7 trillion of asset inflation in an economy worth just over $2 trillion. That would be like every year making more money from the appreciation of your house than from the salary you take home from work. It would be nice if it could happen forever, if we could float simply on a bubble up to prosperity. But we know that in the end, our assets are only worth what we can afford to pay for them. So can the Canadians afford the real estate they have right now? Well, ask RBC and ask the CMHC. CMHC says for a home to be affordable for a family, they shouldn't have to spend more than 30% of their income on housing. According to RBC, the average right now is 50%. So we're 20 percentage points more from family budgets have to go to housing to afford the houses that we live in, for the average person to afford the average house. And that, Madam Speaker, is with record low interest rates. Those payments will only become more expensive when rates rise. So do we have asset inflation in Canada? We have it like we perhaps have never seen before. So the fourth leading indicator of a forthcoming debt crisis: asset inflation, check. Which brings us to the final leading indicator that these Harvard economists developed through 800 years of history of debt crises, and that is current account deficits. Now, current account deficits are basically, to oversimplify for the purpose of saving time, the amount you buy in excess of what you sell. So in essence, Canada buys and sells imports and exports. And the truth is that we buy a lot more than we sell from the rest of the world. In the last, since 2015 to present, Canada has run current account deficits of approximately $300 billion. In other words, we bought $300 billion more from the world than we sold to the world, and we borrowed to make up the difference. How else do you do it? If you're buying more than you're selling, there's only two ways to do it. You drain your savings or you rack up debt. And we've been doing a little bit of both, but most of all, we've been adding debt. And the result is that we are taking on more and more obligations for our prior consumption. Now, I would like to tell you that all of this debt has been used to invest in productive assets like factories and software and patents and other things that will generate income to pay off that debt. But the evidence shows that the overwhelming preponderance of the new debt has been going to immediate consumption. In fact, data that came out after the government's programs came in, programs that I believe were meritorious and had to happen, show that much of the money leaked out of the country because we, as Canadians, we were all buying things that are imported from abroad, more than we were producing and sending to abroad. And that means we are last year again, running a large trade deficit and adding to our overall debt load in the process. In the months April and May of this year, Canadians borrowed an extra $80 billion from foreigners, according to David Dodge, who published a recent piece on this in Public Policy Options. He specifically asked the question of how long it is going to be possible for Canadians, for our country, to borrow from the world in order to buy from the world, before the world gets tired of lending us money. But the bottom line is, we have a large and consistent current account deficit, the second largest in the G7, second only to Japan. And that is an unavoidable problem that we will need to confront, because the world is not going to view our economy as a charity case. The lenders of the world will expect to be paid interest on all of the debt that we carry forward. In fact, Madam Speaker, the only way to pay off that debt is to generate powerful incomes. Unfortunately, since 2012, Canada has exported more investment than it has brought in, by a net amount of $800 billion. In other words, we are sending our investment to productive assets in other parts of the world, while they are sending us debt. They get factories, software, patents, pipelines. We get large-scale debt. So that is the fifth measurement of whether or not a debt crisis will strike. And we can say definitively, with 5 years equaling $300 billion of current account deficits, that Canada indeed meets the standard leading indicator of large current deficits that is necessary to trigger a debt crisis. So 5 indicators, and we check every single box, Madam Speaker. So what can we do about it? The answer is that we need to unleash the power of our productive economy to clear the way for job creation. This is red tape week. Let's eliminate the red tape that prevents businesses from hiring. Let's approve large-scale projects like the Tech Frontier Mine in Alberta or the LNG facility in Saguenay. These are tens of billions of dollars of economic activity. Let's make this the fastest place in the world to get a construction permit. Right now we rank 34th out of 35 OECD nations. Let's be the fastest place to build a factory or to build a pipeline or some other economic infrastructure that pays wages and can reimburse our debts and support our prosperity. Let's change the tax and regulatory rules that get in the way of First Nations communities who are trying to develop commerce and resources on their reserves. Let us remove the penalties for low-income people who get off social assistance so that they can get back to work. Let's allow our newcomers as immigrants to use their qualifications by giving them permits to work in fields for which they are qualified, like the professions and the trades. Let us replace what has become a credit card economy with a paycheck economy. And in that way alone, we will secure our future. Thank you.
Questions and comments.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Happy New Year. Welcome back.
For his, for his lesson on the economy and on debt financing. What's quite clear from where the tenet of what he's proposing and certainly saying is that obviously the situation that we're in is untenable from what he's proposing. And certainly all the investments we made in Canadians in the past year, obviously there was a choice to be made. Us on this side of the House, we decided to invest in Canadians, and he is deriding us for accumulating debt. So I want to know from the member from Carleton, the fact that we've invested too much in Canadians. Obviously, why do we accumulate debt? Was to help Canadians weather this storm, weather the worst pandemic that we all faced as a nation in our lifetime. So I want to know all the programs that this government has brought forward: the CERB, the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, the mortgage deferral payments, the supporting Indigenous communities, the CEBO loans, the Regional Relief and Recovery Fund, the billions of dollars of transfers to the provinces that we provided them to ensure the health and safety of our people, of Canadians. Which one would he have not brought forward?
Before I return the floor to the Honourable Member for Carleton, I'd like to ask members, those members who have raised the question of the hand function, that doesn't appear to be working in Zoom. So we have asked the staff to work towards resolving the issue. As an interim solution, I would suggest that members who wish to ask a question during questions and comments should turn on their camera and physically raise their hands. The table officers will keep a list of those wishing to intervene.
I would also ask members who do not wish to intervene to turn their cameras off so it's easier to identify those who would like to ask a question. Thank you for your cooperation.
Very much, Madam Chair. So what would we have done differently? One, we would not have gone into this crisis having already added $100 billion of debt before the very first case of COVID-19. That's the first thing. This government inherited a balanced budget. They blew through $100 billion of debt before COVID-19 even arrived on the scene. When we warned them, the second thing is we would have ensured the COVID crisis would not have spun out of control here in Canada the way it did, because we would have closed the border. We told them, we're on the record of having said that we would close the border. They had military intelligence in December telling them of the risk, and yet they let 60,000 people come from China between December and March into this country, causing the disease to spread quickly. We would have approved rapid testing more quickly so that Canadians could get back into their jobs safely. We would have procured vaccines on a priority basis rather than leaving us at the back of the pack. All of these things would have saved a fortune. And finally, what will we do different going forward? When we come out of the COVID crisis, we would unleash the engine of free market productive economic growth that produces paychecks for people, rather than shutting down the economy by blocking enterprise, as this government has done in project after project. And we reject the government's proposal to make all the COVID spending permanent. They have asked for it in this bill, asked for an increase in the debt limit of another $700 billion. That's irresponsible.
Members, the opportunity to ask questions. Questions et commentaires. L'honorable députée de Thérèse de...
The honourable member for Thérèse de Blainville.
Vous êtes en sourdine.
You're on mute.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can you hear me? Am I there? I have a question. So the member made a speech about the deficit and the type of plan that they would put in place. I'd like his opinion on an industry that, in our view, should be supported, and that is the aerospace industry. How do you see that fitting into a recovery plan? It seems to us that that industry has been completely abandoned. The honourable member. Clearly, the Conservative Party supports the aerospace industry. I'm a bit confused that the Bloc is of the same view because the aerospace uses oil. Planes run on oil. That's what makes them fly. There's not a single plane I know of that can fly without using oil. And that's our largest export. So yes, we support all industries. I'm surprised the Bloc supports that industry, though, because of its reliance on oil. But we have succeeded internationally in international competition. That industry has been very successful, and our industry uses the cleanest and most ethical oil that comes from Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland.
Member for Winnipeg Centre.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to wish my honourable colleague a Happy New Year. He spoke a lot about debt. I want to speak with him about people who've been left behind, people with disabilities, seniors, students, Indigenous people. Although, like him, we need to certainly watch spending, I don't think it should be on the backs of people. I want to ask him about paying for the debt. The Conservative government, when they have been in power, have fought and supported their corporate friends. I want to know if he agrees with me.
The member says he couldn't make this stuff up. He underestimates himself. You know, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that he brought up our record, because in the first 2 years after we took office, we did what his grandfather would have done. We paid off $40 billion of debt to prepare for the crisis that we knew would one day come. And as a result, we had a buffer. We were prepared, and we had the strongest economy in the G7 through the great globalization.
Seconded by Ms. Bibeau, moves that Bill C-14, an act to implement certain provisions of the economic statement tabled in Parliament on November 30th, 2020, and other measures, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Finance. Debate. The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And I want to say a Happy New Year to you, to all my colleagues that's in the House, and everybody who's participating in this hybrid Parliament today. Before I begin, I'd like to let you know that I will be splitting my time with my honourable colleague from Kingston and the Islands, and I understand that I will need unanimous consent to be able to do this.
This being a hybrid sitting of the House, for the sake of clarity, I will only ask those who are opposed to the request to express their disagreement. Yes? If the members can split their time.
Oh, that's fine. Thank you, ma'am.
There's unanimous consent. Accordingly, the House has heard the terms of the motion, and there being no dissenting voice, I declare the motion carried.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the residents of my riding of Davenport. I'm honored and blessed to represent in this venerable House on Bill C-14. I will be speaking on specifically on some of the important measures that are included in Bill C-14, which is called an Act to Implement Certain Provisions of the Economic Statement tabled in Parliament on November 30th, 2020, and other measures. Since the onset of COVID-19, the Government of Canada has remained steadfast in its commitment to do whatever it takes to protect the health and safety of Canadians and to help Canadian businesses weather the storm. The recently tabled Fall Economic Statement outlines the government's actions to date and proposed new measures to support Canadians through the COVID-19 pandemic. These investments are a down payment on a growth plan of roughly up to 3 to 4% of GDP, or between $70 to $100 billion over 3 years, to jumpstart Canada's economy once the virus is under control. C-14 is an important step in the government's plan. It urgently moves forward with measures from the Fall Economic Statement that would provide immediate assistance to families with young children, students, and businesses, and measures that will help protect the health and safety of Canadians. For example, the bill will ensure that Canadians whose Canada Emergency Response Benefit claim has been delayed can receive the income support that they are eligible for after the end of this year. This bill would also amend the Food and Drugs Act to help prevent and alleviate future drug shortages by allowing the government to make regulations to require pertinent information on potential shortages and activities related to food, drugs, and other items be provided to the Minister of Health when necessary. Madam Speaker, the Fall Economic Statement also moves forward with a plan to set new national standards for long-term care in recognition of the tragic deaths from COVID-19 that we saw in the spring. And I would also say in the fall and ongoing right now. It seeks to establish a $1 billion safe long-term care fund that will help provinces and territories protect seniors and our most vulnerable. In particular, Bill C-14 would provide funding of up to $505.7 million over the coming months to support long-term care facilities, including funding to prevent the spread of COVID-19 infection, outbreaks, and deaths in supportive care facilities. Our federal government also recognizes that the emotional and mental health effects of the pandemic on Canadians will continue as we face a second wave and public health measures continue to be in place. Indeed, half of Canadians report that their mental health has worsened during COVID-19. Bill C-14 would provide funding to improve vital access to virtual care and mental health tools. This includes important investments to bolster distress centres and to provide further support for the Wellness Together Canada portal, which connects Canadians to peer support workers, social workers, psychologists, and other professionals to help address mental health and substance use issues. These investments will help ensure that Canadians have the mental health supports they need when they need it the most. In addition to the $505.7 million for long-term care, this bill would provide funding of up to $395.6 million to support a range of initiatives to help Canadians cope during the pandemic and to continue our fight against the virus, including the following: mental health and substance use programming, innovative approaches to COVID-19 testing, virtual care and mental health tools, and medical research, treatments and therapeutics, vaccine funding and development, border and travel measures, and isolation sites. As the members of this House well know, the spring saw many challenges as everything shut down across the country to help reduce the spread of the virus. Suddenly, kids were out of school, daycares were closed, and many families with young children had to find temporary alternatives to their regular childcare arrangements. These challenges have often meant higher, unanticipated costs for Canadian families with children. Our federal government is committed to helping the many families who have been struggling with a wide range of expenses as a result, from providing care to buying tools for at-home learning like books and computers, and often more costly temporary childcare arrangements. That is why the federal government is proposing through Bill C-14 to provide immediate relief for low and middle income families with young children who are entitled to the Canada Child Benefit or CCB. For these families, we are proposing to provide up to $1,200 in 2021 for each child under the age of 6. This would represent an almost 20% increase over the existing maximum annual CCB payment and would have a meaningful impact on families in need of this support during the pandemic. This support would automatically be delivered to families entitled to the CCB who have a net income at or below $120,000 through 4 tax-free payments of $300. Families entitled to the CCB who have a net income above $120,000 would receive 4 tax-free payments of $150 for a total benefit of $600. The first of these payments would be made shortly after the passage of C-14, within a week or two, as I understand, with subsequent payments occurring in April, July, and October of 2021. This temporary assistance would directly benefit about 1.6 families and about 2.1 million children during a period when families are still grappling with the financial impacts they are facing as a result of this pandemic. Madam Speaker, we must also recognize how young people continue to suffer from the economic impacts due to COVID-19. When the pandemic struck, many students had to leave school, and internships and summer jobs became scarce as Canadians did the right thing and they stayed at home. The government is working to ensure that the pandemic does not derail their futures. We are determined to take a number of measures to help youth continue on their career, continue in their schools. In addition to proposed measures from the fall economic statement that would provide more opportunities for young people to gain work experience, our government is also proposing support to ease the financial burden on recent graduates. This important measure, which has received praise from the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, would bring $329.4 million in relief to up to 1.4 million Canadians who are looking for work or otherwise in the early stages of their careers. It would also help graduates from low and middle income families who tend to have higher overall debt levels, as well as recent graduates with disabilities, given that 37% of borrowers who identified as a person with disabilities participated in the repayment assistance plan of the Canada Student Loans Program in 2017-2018. So in conclusion, Madam Speaker, it is clear that Canadians need our support to weather the storm as we continue to fight against COVID-19. That is why I implore all honourable members to join me in swiftly passing Bill C-14 to enable the government to move forward with implementing these important measures from the fall economic statement, to protect the health and safety of Canadians, to support students and recent graduates, and to help families with young children in need. Thank you so much, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Kingston and Yards.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her intervention today. She referred specifically, and I wrote this down because I thought it was a great way of phrasing it. She said that what the government has been doing over the last almost a year now has been a, quote, down payment on a growth plan, end quote. And I think that's so telling because there were really two choices at the beginning of this, Madam Speaker. It was about investing in Canadians and giving them the supports and the tools that they need to get through this pandemic so that we can come out in a better position than had we not. Or it was the alternate, which was to essentially let everybody fend for themselves. And I'm wondering if the member can comment as to how she thinks things would have been had the government not taken these very important steps to invest in Canadians, and how much better off we will be as a result of this work.
Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the honourable member for his excellent question. I think one of the key things when we're introducing these bills and we're introducing these big spending packages is sometimes it's easy in the way we speak to forget that we're still COVID-19 is still strong in this country, and we're still battling it very strongly. And the number one thing that we need to continue to do is we need to continue to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. And only in fighting this pandemic, in ensuring that there is enough support at our long-term care facilities, enough support for our families, enough support for our youth, enough support within Health Canada and all the different regions for our businesses, we are not going to be able to move forward into a strong economic recovery moving forward. So if we did not spend this investment, we would not be able to move forward and restart our economy in a successful way.
Point of order.
Question. Yes, the Honourable Member for Burnaby. Yes.
New Westminster, Burnaby. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The raise hand function on Zoom with the updated software doesn't appear to work. I've been attempting to intervene. I think a number of other members have as well. So I think that that needs to be fixed. Madam Speaker, would like to ask the member a question.
Okay, well, you are correct. The honourable member is correct because I didn't see any raised hand. So the honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby, and we'll have other questions if yes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to ask the member the following. I certainly wish her a Happy New Year. But the provisions in the bill for C14, as she mentions, provides about $100 a month for lower income families for supports for their children, and yet we know that the average cost now for the programs for early childhood education run at about $2,000 a month. So my question is very simple. Why are the supports so small for families that are really struggling to make ends meet through this pandemic? And why didn't the government actually put into place recommendations that have come from child care advocates across this country to invest vigorously and robustly $2 billion into helping to build that foundation for a national child care system?
Honourable member for Davenport.
Thank you so much, Madam Speaker, and I also want to wish the honourable member a Happy New Year. I think the honourable member knows that we have spent almost $400 billion in supports to help not only Canadian families, Canadian workers, but also businesses through this pandemic. The measure that he's referring to is the additional dollars that we're providing, totaling up to $1,200 for each child under the age of 6, and that is for the next year, and it represents a 20% increase over the maximum annual CCB payment. So this is to provide some additional support. I will say to you that if I go through the $381 billion we've already spent, I can go through the amount of money that we have put for childcare to support families in a number of different ways. And this government has shown time and time again that we will step up when we need to. We will be there for families. We will have families back. And if this isn't enough, then we will come back with even more funding and more supports as time moves on. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires? Questions and comments?